In my last video on my public channel, I briefly mentioned an article from Bloomberg titled "Implicit Bias Training Doesn't Work." Here's an excerpt. Despite the growing adoption of unconscious bias training, there is no convincing scientific evidence that it works. In fact, much of the academic evidence on implicit bias interventions highlights their weakness as a method for boosting diversity and inclusion. Now, this article goes on to point out the flaws with the training, including the weak predictive ability of the implicit association test to predict biased behaviours. The vast majority of people labelled racist by these tests behave the same as the vast majority of people labelled non-racist. Do we really want to tell people who behave in non-racist ways that they are unconsciously racist? Or conversely, tell people who behave in racist ways that they aren't deep down racist at all? So basically, the test is useless. And it's not like we found this out yesterday. Here's an article from the Harvard Business Review from 2016. Diversity policies rarely make companies fairer, and they feel threatening to white men. Well, of course they feel threatening to white men because they're the ones who often find themselves on the end of discriminatory hiring practices. But it's not just white men that don't think diversity practices work. The people they are designed to help don't either. In another set of experiments, we found that diversity initiatives also seem to do little to convince minorities that companies will treat them more fairly. Participants from ethnic minorities viewed a pro-diversity company as no more inclusive, no better to work for, and no less likely to discriminate against minorities than a company without a pro-diversity stance. Now, I don't know what IM Premium subscribers do for a living, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and presume that at least a few of you work for large corporations, perhaps even multinationals, or have done so in the past. And in your daily work life, you've been subjected to some form of diversity training, or perhaps it was called something like awareness raising. And you dutifully went along, listened to the bullshit being espoused, and counted down the seconds until you could get out of there. This phenomenon has now swept through the corporate world, with billions of dollars being spent on so-called D&I initiatives. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Corporations could cut millions in costs overnight by sacking 90% of their human resources departments that add no value through their bullshit diversity agendas. Now, the question I wanted to get to here is, why do companies persist in doing it? Yes, you can find some advocacy research that touts the benefits of diversity on organisations, like the now received wisdom that more women on corporate boards leads to higher profitability. But when you look behind the curtain, there's usually no there there. Having recently read Douglas Murray's book, The Madness of Crowds, Gender, Race and Identity, Murray addresses why this might be the case, and he outlined it further on a recent podcast with some specific examples. Take a listen.
Do you have any theories on how this can even happen? That how is it that a company whose core business, you might think, be to selling coffee, suddenly gets hijacked by an agenda which has got nothing to do? What's up with coffee?
I know why that's happening.
Okay, tell me.
It's the same reason it's happening with banks and with a lot of other large corporations. Here it is. Okay. Starbucks is what most people would think of as being one of the most evil faces of capitalism. I'm a capitalist, but I think there are parts of capitalism that I dislike very much. Like, I think most capitalists. There are unacceptable faces of capitalism at all eras. One is groups, and I suppose we ought to be careful of this one for defamation, but an awful lot of very large multinationals, among other things, for instance, skip taxes, don't pay their taxes in the countries that they earn money in, have incredibly circuitous arrangements for it. The public don't like this. Right and left, we don't like this.
Yeah.
The left in particular has made clear how much they dislike it. So what these companies are doing, these multinationals are doing in particular, is to do very loud, ostentatious appeals to show that they are on board with the zeitgeist. A good example is, I may have said this to you before, Barclays Bank. After 2008 and the banking crisis, it's very striking. There's a lot of things the banking sector and the financial sector ought to have done. There was a lot of blame that they should have got and escaped from. the cheapest way you can get out of that is to suck up the woke agenda and do it very visibly. So that Barclays Bank goes for LGBT Pride Month in a huge way. And Starbucks demonstrates that it wants to transition children into the opposite sex with their cookies. And this means that the evil Starbucks thing goes down quite a significant amount at the cheapest possible outlay by Starbucks. And Barclays and all the other banks that ought to have taken far more criticism for what happened in 2008 get to dodge that by the ostentatious appeal to the woke agenda.
Have you come
across... It's the cheapest way.
So he's talking about virtue signalling. Not a new concept, but as usual, Murray has the ability to cut through and clarify in the way he delivers his message. And he also has a recommendation for how to push back against companies that do this.
This just has to be called out more. We have to recognise, we as consumers of this stuff, we have to recognise that we're being played. And that's why I should stress I'm especially vitriolic about Starbucks. I want them to realize that there will be a cost to this stuff. It's not just that there's nothing to lose and actually we'll gain a bit by our horrible, inedible products, including this mermaid cookie for adults. Yeah. We might actually suffer. People might point out how inedible our products are and how disgusting our coffee is and how really anyone should buy coffee anywhere other than Starbucks. They ought to know that the share price can go down as well as up. They ought to know that there's a cost, potentially. I can't do it myself, but if enough people do it, there will be a cost to playing these games. There's not just an advantage. There could be a cost to it. And I've often wondered, throughout my adult life, why are there so few people willing to stand up and defend truths and principles and facts and hard facts? And one of the few breakthroughs I've made on this is the realization that most people are not interested in truth. Most people are not interested in any of that. What they are interested in is a cost-benefit risk analysis. And if it goes one way and it's wrong but makes them more money, they'll do it. And if it goes the other way and it's right but it doesn't increase the share price, they won't. So, subtly or otherwise, more people have to make sure that the cost-benefit analysis goes the other way. And making the horrible tooth-rotting mermaid coffee to transition young children in the UK is not just an encouragement of child abuse by this coffee chain, but something that could cost it. Yeah. I won't be buying any coffee from there. Frankly, I never really did, other than a couple of times to discover how disgusting and inedible their products are. But if more people just decided that we could ensure that there are different, then we might get to a stage where at the very least we could get to the point where our banks have no particular views on gay sex. Our coffee doesn't have to involve the medical transition of children. And we can just get on with what we should be doing with our lives.
And I want to second that. I want companies that virtue signal pointless causes to distract from their own shortcomings to pay a price for it. What Starbucks is doing is particularly egregious, encouraging the gender transitioning of children. But there are plenty of other examples. ANZ Bank here in Australia is famous for pushing the gender pay gap nonsense. And whilst I realise it's a pain in the arse to go through the process of changing banks, if enough people do it and let them know why they're doing it, perhaps we can get back to a world, as Murray describes, where bankers get on with the business of banking and Starbucks can get back to the business of selling diluted toilet water as coffee. As usual, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you next time.